Thank you. Art Lim is my grand uncle, and I'd like to quote what Patty Gooley said in her book about him. He was a humble man who found greatness without aspiring to it. Art Lim remains to this day one of the unsung heroes of his time. So our talk today is to tell you about this unsung hero. We're so proud of him. Art Lim was one of the first pilots to introduce aviation to China, and he was instrumental in establishing its Air Force. Much of this information is taken from the book Time Flies, and it's written by Patty Gooley. I want to thank Cynthia Lee for her photos. She is actually the granddaughter of Art Lim. And also, this is my own research that I've been doing at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And I want to thank all the archivists there who've helped me. Now, I'd like to introduce you to my two daughters. One is Casey, and then the other one is Lynn. And they have been so helpful. So carry on, Casey.
Okay, I'm going to take it from here. Next slide, please. Okay, so born as Lum Buk Yun on December 27th in 1890, Art Lim had humble beginnings. He was born at his family home called Dog Patch Ranch in a wooden shack in the Potrero district of San Francisco. Next. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Shan Qi, the mother, and Lim Lip Hong, who was mentioned earlier, the father. As a young child, he would help his mother gather chicken and duck eggs and sell them in the neighborhood. So if you take a look at this picture, on the left is Shan Qi, on the right is Lim Lip Hong, and then this picture in the center has them with their 7 children. Starting from the left, the daughter, her name is Siu Young, so just keep her in mind because she comes up later. And Art Lim is the one on the right, the tall one in the back. And that is who our story is about. The one in the center back is Lim Sing. That's my mother's grandfather, my great-grandfather. Okay, so due to his Chinese ethnicity, Art wasn't allowed to attend the all-white school in his neighborhood, nor would the streetcars stop for him or any Chinese. Next slide, please. Therefore, his father, Lim Lip Hong, would take him and his siblings on a horse-drawn cart 4 miles to school in Chinatown every day. But he and his brothers were lucky to go to school at all, because his older brother, Lim Sing, and his 2 older sisters, Siu Yuk and Siu Young, were not afforded an education because they were girls, and Sing had to work to help support the family. Next. At the age of 10, Art Lim was sent to live with his newly married older sister, Siu Young, in San Francisco, Chinatown. That's the one that I pointed out earlier on the left. Siu Young was 18 years old when she married Wang Yit Yao, who was 22 years her senior. He was considered one of the wealthiest Chinese people outside of China and held a prestigious leadership role in the Chinese community, as well as the white American community. So why would a man of such grand standing decide to marry a woman from such a humble background as Siu Young? Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which lasted until 1943, curbed the influx of Chinese to America, particularly that of women. Around the turn of the century, about 4% of the Chinese population in the US was female. The ratio of Chinese men to women was about 20-1. Xu Yang was rumored to be the prettiest woman in Chinatown at that time, so she was probably very sought after. Her father, many years previously, was awarded with a special robe by the Chinese Emperor Guangxi for his leadership role in the completion of the American Transcontinental Railroad. And although he was not a wealthy man, this award, as well as the fact that he had a beautiful daughter of marriageable age, gave him leverage and bargaining power to arrange a prestigious marriage for her. That is how Xu Yang ended up being married to this very wealthy and powerful man. And since Art grew up under their care, he became highly influenced by both of them. Wang Yao helped raise Art from the age of 10 to 21 and was very much a father figure to him. Next. By the time Wang Yao married Xu Yang, he had established himself as a very successful businessman. He was the owner of a Chinese newspaper, a gambling establishment, and he was a chief executive officer of the all-powerful Chinese Six Companies. He was a strong leader, respected and revered by many, even by the numerous rival Tong gang members who came to him to arbitrate between gangs because of his honesty and high ethics. Upon his early death in 1912, at the age of 51, the San Francisco Chronicle printed photos of his funeral procession, pictured here on the right, with the caption, quote, "Procession during the funeral parade of Wang Yao, Chinatown's richest resident, the procession being the greatest of its kind ever seen in the Oriental Quarter," end quote. February 5th, 1912. Even the Tong gangs held a 24-hour peace treaty so that all could pay their respects. At 29 years of age, Xu Yang found herself widowed and pregnant with their fourth child. With no chance of remarrying, she had to support herself and her family. Luckily, her forward-thinking husband had prepared her for this and taught her everything she needed to know to continue running the newspaper and gambling businesses. It was unheard of for a woman, but Xu Yang did just that, and very well. She would eventually be known as Queen of the Chinese Lotteries. She also donated a great deal of funds in support of women's education in both America and China. Before Wang Yao's passing, during Art Lim's high school years, he followed his brother-in-law's influence and became a natural leader in his own right. He was routinely nominated to serve as captain of whatever sports team he was involved with. These included baseball, rugby, track and field, and football. He was active in the interdenominational Chinese YMCA and the Chinese Students Association. After high school, Art studied business and started working for his brother-in-law's newspaper, but his real passion was in mechanical engineering and aviation. Next. Art was inspired by the Wright brothers and actually met Orville Wright at the 10-year anniversary of their first flight. Art attended the Glenn Curtis School of Aviation in San Diego in 1913. He was the second aviator of Chinese descent to be licensed by the Aero Club of America. Glenn Curtis was effusive in his compliments with regards to Art's performance and declared that Art was one of the most brilliant students in his school. Tom Gunn, Art's friend from high school, was the first Chinese-American aviator who had graduated a semester before and was Art's best friend. He and Tom Gunn were then recruited later at different times by Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai to come to China and help set up their aviation. However, so Art knew his race would always be a barrier for him in the US. due to the heightened discrimination against Chinese Americans. China, on the other hand, praised and embraced his piloting skills. He knew he would be able to, quote, literally fly high in China versus the US, and as a result, he chose a career in China. In 1913, he was invited by Yuan Shikai, the president of China at that time, to become the instructor of aviation to the Chinese army. In preparation, Art Lim went to New York to further his training, and he took an advanced course in aviation with Glenn Curtis. He was the first Chinese graduate of that school, and he was the first Chinese graduate of that school and the first person to fly over the frozen lake Queka. He then purchased a Curtiss hydroplane to bring to China. In 1914, Art moves to China in the hopes of becoming an aviation instructor and also as a representative of the Curtiss Aircraft Company. However, during this time, funds were low in the politics, and so the job that he was promised as an aviator instructor did not actually manifest for quite a few years. So during this time, he began doing flying exhibitions to large crowds to try to entice interest in aviation. There was also a lot of change of power and warring and emergence of warlords. So in order to support himself, Art started a wallpaper business, a driving school for chauffeurs, and he helped to start a fire department in China. Next. By 1917, Art became a loyal friend and supporter of Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, who also worked under Sun Yat-sen. And with Tom Gunn, Art organizes the Canton Air Corps and serves as deputy team chief. Next. In 1925, Art marries Sarah Lau Chuck and adopts her two children, Ruby and Howard. So Ruby was also widowed, and she had two children of her own. Her prospects for remarriage were also very low, but I think because of Art's experience with his sister being widowed and having children, he was open to the concept of marrying a widow who already had children. So he fell in love with Sarah and married her and adopted her two children from her previous husband. And then they went on to have two children of their own, Judy and Renee. And Sarah's children's names were Ruby and Howard. Next. So Art, as previously mentioned, had become friends with Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, so much so that he and his wife Sarah were invited to Chiang Kai-shek's wedding in 1926. And Chiang Kai-shek married Sung Mei-ning, one of the famous Sung sisters. During that time in 1927, Chiang then hires Art into the Chinese military. Next. When Chiang Kai-shek comes to power, he appoints Art to become the Brigadier General Chief of Staff of the Canton Air Force. And during this time, Art is stationed in various parts of China, such as Shanghai, Nanjing, and Guangdong. This is in 1932. Next. During this time, the Japanese have taken Manchuria piece by piece for themselves without a fight, setting up Puyi as a cover. But this alert starts the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1931. Chiang has fled to establish a new capital in Chongqing ahead of the approaching Japanese. The Japanese are on a strong and rapid takeover of towns south of Manchuria. The Japanese made up a story that they are missing a soldier at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937 and demand an inspection. They are expecting to take over Shanghai in 3 days, but Chiang Kai-shek brings in his elite force who holds off the Japanese for 3 months until they are run out of food and ammunition. Though the killing of all Chinese is limited to those found on the streets, the Japanese honor the protection inside the numerous international settlements because of a previous alliance the Japanese had made with the European countries. Tens of thousands, not only Chinese, but also Jews, Middle Easterners, other Asians flee to the settlements and are saved. The Japanese take the revenge upon the next towns, namely Nanjing, where the worst atrocities of war are committed in the history of war. For 8 years, China fights their aggressor defensively on their own. No one comes out to help until 1939. Russia promises aid with advisors, a few planes, ammunition, because they are afraid that Japan would also take possession of their country should China lose. But the aid stops because they are then seriously involved with the war in Europe. Next. Okay, Lynn, take it away.
Okay, we're also kind of giving some historical context. So, also called the River of Sorrow, Chiang decides to breach the dikes of the Yellow River in order to stop the advancement of the Japanese headed for Wuhan. Thousands are drowned and sacrificed. A very difficult decision. Next. Next slide, please. Okay. The Japanese are seemingly unstoppable because of their advanced training and plentiful supply of advanced aircraft. The Mitsubishi Oscar and the Mitsubishi Zero, which are types of airplanes, are sought after. Combining excellent maneuverability and long distance flying, the Zero was the most capable carrier-based fighter plane in the world during World War II. In early combat operations, the Zero gained a reputation as a dogfighter, achieving an outstanding kill ratio of 12-1. These are pictures of Art Lim with several trade and military dignitaries in which they started to negotiate for these planes, as well as supplies of oil and ammunition for these planes. Next. This is a picture of the Zero. By mid-1942, a combination of new tactics and an introduction to better equipment enabled Allied planes to engage the Zero on generally equal terms. Within a year, the Zero was less effective than newer enemy fighters since it lacked hydraulic boosting, rendering it nearly impossible to maneuver at high speeds. However, design delays and production difficulties hampered the introduction of newer Japanese aircraft models. This allowed the Zero to continue to serve in a frontline role until the end of the war. The Japanese by 1939 have decided to seek the help of President Roosevelt personally with a visit with Chiang Kai-shek, his wife Madam Chiang, and Madam's brother TV Soong, who already have a close relationship with the president. Aid is promised to China. Next. During this time, Art Lim is made director of a newly built aircraft with top engineers, American Charles Day and Zakharenko from China. It took a year to refine it as the second largest factory in China with the latest in design and technology. They built mainly the P-42 and the P-43 planes, and also copied designs of other imported planes purchased by Art's team. Next. The Shaoguan Aircraft Factory in Guangdong, which is where Art Lim is based, is bombed multiple times, and Art barely escapes with most of his staff and crew. So they take apart planes and gather equipment and at first they take the water route two routes. First, they take the water route and they go from Hong Kong to Haiphong in Vietnam, and then take a train to Kunming, where they build an airfield. But then the Japanese bombed the railroad. If you can see on the map, there's that little railroad in the middle there. That gets bombed out. And they had taken over Indochina and they blocked that route. So the red line, as you can see on that map, is the second route that Art Lim and his crew takes to move plane parts over land to Kunming. Next. So this is a picture of Art Lim where he is moving in the first route. He's on a boat and he's carrying plane parts over to Haiphong. Next. And this is the picture of when the water route was blocked, and because they were now taking the land route, they're taking a land route through Guangxi. And here is pictures of Art Lim going along the land route. Next. Along the land route, he and his crew built the much needed P-40s under trees or in sheds as camouflage. This technique serves to protect them from Japanese pilots who cannot spot them. These plane parts make it to the Kunming airfield where they are assembled. Their ultimate aim is to escape further inland with all their plane building equipment to Kunming. Next. This is a picture of the land route in which Madam Chang helped fund all of the transportation. You can see the trucks that are carrying all the plane parts along the land route. Next. This is an airfield, and Art Lim oversaw the building of the Kunming airfield in 1939 to 1940. This was just in time for the Flying Tigers, and then he left to raise money in the US and South America for the continuation of buying planes and plane parts. I'm going to show a video, a very short video, but keep in mind this is a historical video, so there are some derogatory terms that are stated. Could you please play the video?
You are seeing a miracle. In less than 3 months, these people built a chain of airfields that could handle the biggest American bombers. They built them on the land that formerly raised their food. They built them by hand. Their pay was 20 cents and a bowl of rice a day, and the Japs the American planes would kill. As many as 90,000 people worked on a single field. From 8-year-old children to 80-year-old patriarchs. And women worked as hard as men.
Next slide, please. Okay, this is a picture of General Chenault. Well, he was the Chinese general. He was hired by the Chinese, created the famous American volunteer group, later known as the Flying Tigers. The Flying Tigers, made up of Chinese Americans and white Americans, turned the tide in favor of China and boosted morale in their short one-year mission. They used the Kunming airfield as their main air base. Knowing that Kunming was the only viable airport left in China, it was a very critical base. It was the only lifeline in China. The Japanese were unable to destroy the Kunming airfield due to the counterattack of the Flying Tigers. Chenault solidified China's control of Kunming airfield, and they kept Japan away with their P-40 squadron, stalling the Japanese in 1941. Next. As you know, we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor that brings the US out of neutrality and into the war against Japan and Europe. Next. This is a picture of, in retaliation for the Pearl Harbor bombing, President Roosevelt ordered the bombing of Tokyo and a few other cities. Jimmy Doolittle, a friend of Art Lim's, visited the Shaoguan airfield and was lead pilot in the bombing of Tokyo. These bomber BF-25 planes were the first to take off from an aircraft carrier in the USS Hornet. Jimmy Doolittle would become a four-star general in the US military. He and Art shared a passion for improving the technological performance of planes. Oh my goodness. Can you guys hear all that music behind me? Okay, next slide, please. This slide is just to show you how Japan controlled all of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands and had taken over Burma at this in 1942. Next slide, please. The Burma Road was critical because it led to Kunming, where the airfield was located. Next.
According to one eyewitness, it was scratched out of the mountains with fingernails. For months, some 200,000 Chinese labored, and many died, so that blockaded China could fight on.
Yeah, as you can see, it was a huge task with the valiant effort from all the people in the surrounding areas. This just shows the Burma Road, the different routes of the Burma Road. It was 550 miles long. Art Lim was assigned to the U.S. military at this time to the Foreign Affairs as a Allied liaison officer. He was a liaison between the Chinese government and the U.S. Navy. He was the supply agent for India, Kunming, and several provinces in the last battles. When these roads were cut off by the Japanese, then the only way to get the supplies to Kunming was by air over the Himalayan mountains from India. Next. This is Art Lim as an Allied liaison officer. Next. These are jungle pack animals that were helped that were used to help build the Burma, and there's another road called the Lido Road through the jungles. Next. If you could play this one too.
Stilwell said the last word on the campaign.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
Next. So this map shows how Japan controlled Burma and bombed out both the Lido and Burma Road, forcing the Allies to ship supplies to the Kunming airfield by plane. The pink dotted line over that you can see on the map was called Aluminum Alley because when flying over the Himalayas, the pilots could see the reflections of all the crashed airplanes. 30 to 40% of the planes crashed flying over the Himalayas. The pilots were Flying Tigers, the Allied forces, and the Chinese Air Force. Next. This is a picture of the bomber jacket that the fighter pilots would wear, and it has a little message on the bottom that is in English and Chinese to allow those who found them to try to tell them to please rescue these pilots and return them to their air bases so that they can continue fighting in the war. Next. This is a picture of the B-24 pilots by the CNAC from India to Kunming. Next. This is the picture of the P-40 fighter protecting loaded CNAC transport planes over the hump to Kunming. Next. There were, as we know, Burma was taken over, so there was a lot of Burmese refugees as well as other refugees. Next.
As the Allies retreated, there joined with them an ever-growing mass of refugees, Burmese whose homes and lives had been shattered. The Allies did what they could for these refugees, and through brilliant leadership and individual fortitude, managed to keep ahead of the Japs.
Because of the Japanese destruction of the Burma Road, several allied countries and local tribes band together to fight the Japanese, and they supported the rebuilding of the Burma Road. Art Lim was most likely part of this effort. Next.
It wasn't long before India became a vast armed camp. From the independent kingdom of Nepal came the Gurkhas. From the Naga Hills, Naga headhunters joined forces with the Allies. From East Africa and West Africa came more troops. From Burma came the Burma Rifles. And from the Chin Hills, Chin and Kachin tribesmen. Scots, Irish, English, Welsh, Australian, New Zealander, Indian, Gurkha, Burman, African, Chinese, American. Never was there such a polyglot army.
Next, okay. 6 divisions that the U.S. Army brought in to rebuild the Burma Road were African-American segregated units. It is important that we recognize this effort, and Art Lim was probably involved in this effort because he was the liaison between the U.S. and China to rebuild the highlights. Next.
Okay. So I do personally, as a historian, think that this victorious heroic narrative has, hidden some of the parts that maybe should have.
Next. Would you like to take over from here?
Okay, is it my turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what do you think? Isn't it amazing that they had so many races gathering together to fight for China? I think that really moved me a great deal. I want to conclude with Art Lim. I had many questions about him. For one, the way he ended his life was very puzzling. He, at the end of the war, he was victorious, you would think, because they won and kept China free. And a lot of it was because of him. He's the one who built the Kunming airfield. If it weren't for that as a lifeline to China, there would be no China. It was the only airfield left that was still working. The Japanese couldn't get to it. So at the end of his life, everybody left and they all went home or wherever. And they had a choice. Everybody had a choice of where they wanted to go after the war. But what puzzled me was Art did not choose what I thought would be reasonable. He could have chosen to go follow Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, where his party and his generals followed him, and he promised them wealth and a very good life and high ranking, or he would have chosen to go to the United States. He was already ranked as an officer, and he would have had comfortable home with his family again. And the third choice, he refused to go to Taiwan. He refused to go back to America. But there was a third offer. The communists, they offered to him, having heard about his reputation, if he would come and start their Air Force. Well, he denied them too. And this is what puzzled me for the longest time. Why on earth did he not go to any of them? He chose instead to stay with his abandoned Air Force. His pilots, they were persecuted. They had no chance of getting another job in China because it was now communist. So he ended up in Hong Kong in a little apartment that was 500 square feet, where his family and children and his wife had to live and eke out a living. Why did he choose that? And this is the legacy that I want to ask everybody. Why did he do that? What was he thinking? He had a clear mind and he was still a vibrant man. Why on earth would he choose to live a life of being penniless? So I went to visit my uncle, who had lived in China throughout the World War. And he told me, it shocked me a great deal, turned my whole thought around. He said to me that even though he lived in China throughout the war, and the Japanese had invaded their town, they had to move their home 5 times. He said that there were really good Japanese and bad Japanese, but he told me, don't judge them. They're both good and both bad. And he told me how the good ones protected them. The good Japanese, no matter which town he went, the good ones would gather up the women, put them in a room, and lock the door, and they would put a sign there that said, "Do not enter." And this was to protect the women from the bad force. So you see, they did a lot of protection as well as being aggressive. When he said that, I decided to start looking into why he would think about that towards the Japanese, because I was angry after looking at a lot of war movies. And then I looked at, studied Renee Lim Robertson. She's the daughter of Art Lim. And she explained that Art Lim had a legacy that he had learned from his father, Lim Lip Hong. And it goes something like this. Everybody is the same, no matter where you are, what you do, where you're from, or what your skin color is. When we learn this simple truth, we will have world peace. Now, can you imagine Art Lim, he's working with his polyglot troops of all races. He's learning this lesson through experience. They are all the same. We are all the same. And then Auntie Renee, she started an exhibit at the Seattle Museum of Flight. She commissioned 2 airplanes. One was the first airplane ever built by China called Rosamond. And then she contacted Japan Airlines and asked the president, would you create the first airplane ever built in Japan, and I will bring it to this museum together. So this is what's puzzling to me too. I couldn't understand, why would you do that? Your dad just fought the war against Japan, and now you're going to bring the Japanese plane together with his plane that he built. Well, she did that. The other thing I found is that this is very interesting. The Japanese, the Emperor Hirohito, when he was interviewed, this is what they revealed to the reviewer, that the Japanese, I'm going to read this, the Japanese were petrified that they were going to be dealt the same fate that China suffered from the British during the 2 Opium Wars of 1840. They watched very closely how defenseless the Chinese felt as their land was being carved up by European nations. And this created what we know today is the start of China's 100 years of humiliation. Now, Japan at that time was not thinking about war, but they saw what was happening with China, and they were frightened. As a result, they volunteered to fight in World War I so that they could be part of the Allies. At the end of the war in World War I, the 4 powerful Western countries, and that included, all the ones that won in World War I, England, America, etc. They gathered together and they decided that Japan, even though they fought in the World War, would not receive the rewards that they deserved. Not only that, Japan had suggested that because of this war, they wanted all nations to respect the whole world, regardless of race. Now, can you understand this? They wanted this war to understand that the problem is race, respecting race of all nations. So then I began to understand why Japan actually felt that they had to build up their military and that they had to become like a colonizing Western country. in order to protect themselves from being victimized like China. So anyway, this is what I believe is what Art Lim was trying to tell everybody through his decision that he is not going to make a choice for any of these countries that did not offer friendship. And none of them did. Neither Chiang Kai-shek or the Americans nor the communists. Nobody offered their hand out to any of the other countries. And he ended up very disillusioned. And that's his story. That's what he's trying to tell and leave for everyone to think about. Okay, that's what I was hoping that the story would present. Now this is his family. As you can see, he's sitting there with his wife Sarah and his two daughters, Renee and Judy. His family in the United States is this large crowd, and Art Lim is the fellow in the center, the tallest one, and his granddaughter Cynthia is here on the right, and she's wonderful. She let me use her timeline and her photographs. I think, Sufan, you have something to say about that, right?
Yes.